right, so we're ready to get going here. Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Ramsey, and I first of all have to thank all of you for giving up your Saturday afternoon on a beautiful spring day, at least it is in Stanton, to listen to a seminar on animal cruelty. I have to admit that I was surprised when John told me yesterday how many people had signed up for the event. I'm not sure I ever signed up for a Saturday afternoon event in the spring, so I think it's really great, and I thank you for being here to talk about this. I would like to talk to you briefly at the beginning of this. Is going to be a little bit of the history about the animal cruelty laws in general. I won't bore you with too much of that, but I do think it's kind of important to hear a little bit about that. And also then we'll specifically talk about the Virginia laws and how they protect animals. And just so you know, I won't be showing you any horrible slides or horrible videos that are going to make you wish you hadn't taken the seminar. It'll be a nice, relaxing, if not disturbing, discussion about the link between animal cruelty and human violence and some of the basic laws and situations involving animal cruelty around the country and the history as well. So looking back at the beginning of our animal cruelty laws and the history of animal cruelty laws, believe it or not, we actually have quite a bit of history. Oh, sorry, I went too fast. History of our laws going back all the way to the 1600s when the Massachusetts Bodies of Liberties enacted something within their Bodies of Liberty, as they called it, that prevented tyranny and cruelty towards brute creatures. And so even back in the 1600s, there were people that cared about this issue. In 1809 in Parliament, Lord Erskine tried to introduce a bill, which would have been the first really seriously debated legislative bill in front of a body, to make it cruel to treat animals badly. The bill passed the House of Lords, but was defeated in the House of Commons. Then in 1823, London formed its first chapter of the Royal Society for Protection of Animals. And I'm sure most of you have heard about that. And that was, of course, how we ended up with the ASPCA, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. In 1829, New York passed a first law that had to do with maliciously killing and wounding animals, mostly work animals in general, particularly horses and other animals that were used for transportation and farming. And then between 1800 and 1850, all across the United States, there was becoming awareness of how wrong animal cruelty was. And a lot of states around the countries and probably towns and cities started using some of the existing. I think we have somebody got their unmute off. But anyway, so some of the cities and towns around the country started passing their own little laws or passing ordinances that allowed them to charge animal cruelty through existing law. And some of those might have been even things like malicious mischief or disorderly conduct, things like that, just to be able to charge animal cruelty in areas where there weren't animal cruelty laws, which were quite a few. And then in 1866, something interesting happened. Henry Berg, many of you I'm sure you've heard of, who was the father of the ASPCA, took a trip to Europe, and he saw firsthand some of the cruelties that were being perpetuated in some of the countries there. But he observed more than anything the Royal Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And that got his attention because he saw this large charitable group that had recently been formed trying to protect animals, and not only trying to protect them, but to enforce laws, to enact laws to make it illegal to treat animals cruelty. And that was a big step in the beginning of our own laws in this country. So Henry Berg, who was born in 1811 and died in 1888, came back and he decided he was going to dedicate his life to this. And he founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the ASPCA, in 1866. And that was 3 days after one of the first effective legislations against animal cruelty was passed into law in New York State. And what was kind of interesting, and of course he was behind this, he knew everybody, and it pushed really hard to get this through. And one of the really interesting things about these laws that he got passed, and they were the first state laws passed in this country. Somebody's still unmuted. But anyway, these laws were important because they not only apply to these laws.
Okay, Sherry, I'm not sure. It's someone who's not Mark. Mark, you are unmuted, and if you would please mute. Trying to figure out who that is, but I'm not seeing them in the list, which is...
John, can you unmute everybody but me?
Actually, you're in control of that now. So, yeah, so please check and make sure that your mic is muted.
Okay. So what was interesting about these laws and what was kind of important about them was that they just didn't apply to property interest of the owners of the animals. They applied regardless of whether or not there was an owner of these animals. And that was kind of an interesting first step in the evolution of our animal laws around the country, in the sense that we decided as a country, or as a state in New York State, eventually in the country, that animals in and of themselves, even though they're not humans, even though they don't have innate human rights, that they deserve to have rights in a sense of protection, that we as a society thought we should protect animals from cruelty. So in 1866, when these laws were first enacted, that was a huge step in the evolution of the animal cruelty laws. And they were typical in the sense that a lot of these laws said similar things with regard to maliciously killing and injuring and torturing and beating, those types of things. But in this case, with this law, it also notes any animal could be protected under this. And another provision had to do with the old, maimed, and diseased horses that were let loose in the streets. And that was specifically because Henry Berg was very disturbed by the carriage horses in New York City and the way they were treated. And very often when they couldn't pull or carry anybody anymore, they were just abandoned to the streets. So that was another reason he was very concerned about. We still fight that fight in New York City today with the carriage horses being mistreated. But this was the beginning of laws being enacted to try to protect them. Now, an interesting thing happened around this time. About less than 10 years later, at this point, there were no protection laws on the books for children. So oddly enough, there were protection laws for animals before there were protection laws for humans. So about 1874, a Methodist mission worker named Etta Angle Wheeler found a 10-year-old dirty little skinny girl dressed in threadbare clothing, and she had bruises and scars. If you look at her legs in this picture, you'll see the gashes in her legs. And this woman was so concerned about her, but she couldn't find anybody to help her. She couldn't get anybody to go out and check on this little girl. There were no specific laws to help this little girl in the sense that animals to this day are treated as property. Back at this time, in the vein of Oliver's, we saw in the movie about New York, London streets. This is not that unusual around our country as well, in big cities, where children were treated almost like slaves. And this particular little girl had no family, and she was adopted from a charitable group by this couple, and she was treated very, very badly. And this mission worker could not find anybody to help her. So she was so upset that one day her niece said to her, "You're so troubled over this little abused child. Why not go to Mr. Berg? She is a little animal, surely." Henry Berg sent out an SPC investigator to the home to verify what was going on. He pretended to be a census worker. And he documented exactly what they assumed was going on, how badly this child was being treated and kept and neglected. And as a result of this case, the authorities eventually removed her from the home. And it became news. It was a news in the New York Times about how Mr. Berg had expanded his mission of treating, finding animals being treated badly, but he was also now looking for children to be treated badly and trying to help them. And these two articles that were written in a couple of days about the court hearing are very interesting in the sense that this article says Mr. Berg does not find his humane impulse to his heart to soothing the pathway of the brute creature for the brave or elsewise, but he embraces within the sphere of his kindly efforts the human species also. So it's interesting to see here that this was also in some ways the beginning of the child protection movement, and that people were trying to reach out to find ways to not only protect animals, but to protect humans as well. This is where Henry Berg is embarrassingly buried in Brooklyn. So within a few years, there was a rippling effect of these laws that were passed in New York, and many other states started adopting similar laws. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Illinois, New Hampshire, and New Jersey all adopted very similar laws relatively quickly after New York passed their laws. And they also did another thing. They created their own charters of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So there's a New Jersey SPCA, there's a Massachusetts SPCA, and that kept going around the country because of these laws that were passed in 1866 in New York. Virginia also passed their animal cruelty laws in 1893. And as you probably know, there are SPCAs located in Virginia as well. 20 years after Berg started these efforts in New York, there was a wonderful statement made by a judge in Mississippi about some laws that were proposed there. And he said, the statute is for the benefit of animals as creatures capable of feeling and suffering, and it was intended to protect them from cruelty without reference to their being property or to the damages which might thereby be occasioned to their owners. Laws and the enforcement or observance for laws for the protection of dumb brutes from cruelty are, in my judgment, among the best evidence of the justice and benevolence of man. To disregard the rights and feelings of equals is unjust and ungenerous, but to willfully and wantonly injure or oppress the weak and helpless is mean and cowardly. Cruelty to them manifests a vicious and degraded nature, and it tends inevitably to cruelty to men. But however this may be, human beings should be kind and just to dumb brutes, if for no other reason than to learn how to be kind and just to each other. And that's the subject of this seminar today. So we're going to have a real quick review now of the animal cruelty laws, specifically the animal cruelty laws in general, and how Virginia protects animals. The state cruelty laws are particularly the thing we're going to look at. There are certainly, as you know, federal laws like the Endangered Species Act, but they don't affect the day-to-day cruelty of animals around the country. The state cruelty laws are the single most important thing that we have in our legal system to address animal cruelty. There are animal cruelty laws in every state, and there's good news with regard to that. We have animal cruelty laws in every state. All states now have some sort of felony cruelty law. All 50 states have some kind of felony dogfighting law, although some don't have animal fighting for other animals as a felony. Most authorities understand that animal cruelty is linked to human violence, and more courts and prosecutors are now becoming aware of the importance of addressing these cases. I do a lot of seminars on this topic for prosecutors and judges, and I'm always surprised at how well and how interested they are in this. So I do think things are changing with regard to that. The bad news is that some state laws exclude whole species of animals from their code, and that goes to our definition of animal, and we're going to talk about that in a second, because the definition will tell us who's covered under our cruelty laws. Some states don't even put their cruelty code within the penal code, but rather in other sections of the statutes, even if there are felony charges. And why is that problematic? Because everybody that's trained, whether they're law enforcement, whether they're prosecutors, whether they're judges, they have that penal code on their desk. That's the one they refer to. That's how they look to charge the laws. If the animal cruelty laws are in another section, it makes it much more difficult for them to be familiar with them. When I prosecuted animal cruelty as a prosecutor, I also lived in a state that did not have the laws in the penal code. So I made it my mission to take a copy of the statute with me every time I went to court on an animal cruelty case, just so I could politely provide it to the judge in case he or she wasn't familiar with it. And I also think it lends an air of it not being as important when we don't have them with the other crimes in the penal code. So that's another issue that I think is problematic. We have some law enforcement officers in certain parts of the country that don't want to be involved in animal cruelty, and they don't want to, and they're not trained on it. And I think that's the reason they don't want to be involved in it. And one of the most problematic issues has to do with exemptions in the law. The exemptions are very unique things with regard to our laws. We don't exempt people from breaking the law traditionally. There may be a defense, an affirmative defense of self-defense or something like that, but we don't exempt people. Well, in the animal cruelty laws, we do, and in some ways we have to, because there are things that are legal with some animals that wouldn't be legal with others. So that can be problematic when these exemptions are written or drafted too broadly. So in understanding the animal cruelty laws in your state, and when I talk to prosecutors or law enforcement around the country, I always say there are 4 basic questions you kind of have to understand. That is, what's your state's definition of animal? Are there some animals protected more than others? Are any people or activities exempt from the cruelty laws? And how does your state differentiate between a misdemeanor and a felony crime? So when we looked at Virginia to the definition of animal, we see there are 3 definitions within this provision under 3.2-6500. The first one is just a generic definition that deals with, I guess, anything throughout the law not specified beneath this. And that is that animals are non-human vertebrate species except fish. The second one under 6522 deals with rabid animals, and that is any animal that's susceptible to rabies. But for the purposes of what we're going to talk about today, the third definition is the one that we look to, and that has to do with the animal cruelty laws. The definition of animal for the purposes of the animal cruelty laws is an animal means any non-human vertebrate species, including fish, except those fish captured and killed or disposed of in a reasonable and customary manner. So that except part is another part of an exemption you'll see as we go through this. So in other words, you got pet fish, they're covered under this law. If you're a fisherman and you kill fish, you're not. The fish aren't covered. I tried a case as a prosecutor where some juveniles killed koi fish in a pond. And the woman was so outraged about it. She said that these fish were like her pets. They had names. She and her daughter came out every day after school and fed them. And she was so upset. And we charged animal cruelty and criminal mischief and some other things. And the defense raised the issue of whether or not the fish were animals under the law. And the definition in the state I was in was the whole brood creation. And I argued that the whole brood creation included fish. And the judge ultimately agreed with me. Here, we've got a specific provision that says it includes fish. So there's no argument into that unless they are commercially or being fished as part of a license to fish. Another definition that's important under Virginia law is a companion animal, which means any domestic or feral dog, domestic or feral cat, non-human primates, guinea pigs, hamsters, rabbits not raised for human food. So if it's a pet rabbit, it's covered under the cruelty laws. If it's a rabbit that's going to be sold for fur or food, it's not. Certain reptiles that are pets, native birds, the whole list goes on and on. But at the very end, you'll see no agricultural animals, game species, or animals regulated under federal law as a research animal. So any animal that's part of a research facility is not considered a companion animal, even if it is a dog or cat. Other definitions of importance are agricultural animals, which mean all livestock and poultry. And underneath, you see the definitions for livestock and poultry, as you would guess they would be. Now, the exemptions I was talking about earlier. Virginia is not as bad as a lot of states that have tons of exemptions. Virginia only has a few that are normal, typical exemptions to the law. Here you'll see that nothing in the section should be construed to prohibit dehorning of cattle conducted in a reasonable and customary manner. That's important. You can't go out and set them on fire. You have to do it in a reasonable and customary manner as part of some typical farming practice or reason that's necessary. Under D, does not prohibit authorized wildlife management activities such as hunting, fishing, trapping, as regulated under other titles of the Code of Virginia, or farming activities as provided under this title or regulations adopted hereunder. So those are all narrow exemptions that provide for protection for people that are acting outside the scope of these exemptions. So just to give you an example, I was helping a prosecutor in Wisconsin who had a case where some kids had gone out on their snowmobiles. Evidently, this happens frequently in Wisconsin. And they were taking their snowmobiles down and running down deer, just running them down and slamming them to trees. And the pictures were horrible. And when they were arrested, they claimed they were hunting. And the hunting laws were pretty vague. They had exemptions that were kind of similar to these. And so The lower court was totally bewildered and agreed that they were hunting. So the Attorney General there appealed the case and was able to convince them that this was not what was meant by the exemption for hunting. And they were ultimately convicted and they all went to jail. As you might imagine, these kids had prior records for other things. So they went to jail as a result of this situation. So those are the first three questions I mentioned that you have to understand. The last question has to do with how does the law distinguish from misdemeanor and felony? Now, generally around the country, there are three ways that laws differentiate between misdemeanors and felonies with regard to animal cruelty. Some states provide more protection for cats and dogs than companion animals, which of course, I don't understand that since there are only about 10% of the number of animals around the country. But for some reason, we as a society often deem those kinds of animals to be more important and they should not be treated badly. So some states provide more protection for those animals. Some states differentiate on the type of cruelty. So is it intentional or is it neglect? Well, again, an intentional act might be much less cruel than a neglect act might be. But for some reason, that malicious phrase tends to be at the top of the worst provisions under cruelty laws. Some states look to the extent of the injury of the animal, much like we do with our assault laws. Simple assault versus aggravated assault would be treated differently. That's the way I've drafted a number of animal cruelty laws around the country or helped to draft them. And that's the way I try to get them written because I think they make more sense and are much more fair. And some states use a combination of all these things in very convoluted ways to draft their cruelty laws. So you'll see under Virginia's law, the laws are pretty similar to the ones we saw in New York in some ways. You can't torture animals, you can't, there's a willfully standard there, but you'll also see that it deals with any animal. So this is the broad provision that many states have that deals with many animals or any animal. And it also specifically has a provision about horses in this section, about soaring horses. If you don't know what that is, you should look it up. It's a really sad thing that happens to horses that perform in contests. Also with administering any drugs or medications, those types of things with regard to horses are a crime. Under Section 6, you'll see willfully sets afoot, instigates or engaged in any further act of cruelty, or if they're carried inhumanely in a vehicle, that's inhumane, and that's a Class 1 misdemeanor. So that's your basic law that applies to every animal, and it also covers depriving an animal of food, drink, shelter, emergency veterinary treatment, that sort of thing. That's a Class 1 misdemeanor. It also provides in the little teeny print at the bottom, which you don't need to read, but it just basically says that if anybody's convicted of this, the court has at its discretion the ability to order anger management or psychiatric treatment or psychological counseling. Under B, this again has one of your exemptions there with bona fide scientific medical experiments are not covered. Those animals are not, they're exempt from the cruelty laws. Again, this provision relates to any animal, whether belonging to the person or somebody else. It also goes over some of the same things that we talked about in the other provision. And then as you go down below, there's a malicious standard with regard to companion animals. So now this specifically applies only to companion animals. And you'll see it is a Class 6 felony if it results in the death of the animal, or there's also a repeat offender statute there, that provision there that allows for it to be upgraded if there's a prior offense. And then here again are the exemptions at the top. E has to do with the unlawful killing of a domestic cat or dog for the purpose of obtaining hide or pelt or fur, and that's a Class 6 felony for a second or subsequent violation. It's a Class 1 misdemeanor for the first time. And then under F, anybody that tortures, willfully inflicts beats, maims, mutilates a cat or dog, that's a companion animal, and causes serious bodily injury to that animal, that's a class 6 felony. So again, we're getting much higher grades of crimes for the companion animals. There's a little provision here that says if a dog is attacked on their own property, someone has the right to defend them. And that's in lieu of the dangerous dog laws and vicious dog laws under Virginia law. There's a definition of serious bodily injury, and also notes that a person convicted of this can be prohibited by the court from possessing or owning animals. So that ban on ownership of animals can be a very important thing. There's a small provision here about what an owner of an animal, a companion animal, is required to do. It's pretty basic with regard to food, water, and vet care. It also applies to public and private shelters and foster care facilities, dealers, pet shops, exhibitors, groomers, etc. And the provisions, the penalties below are pretty mild, class 4 misdemeanor for the first violation. And this is the fighting laws. They're very typical of other fighting laws around the country. It covers almost everything: promote, prepare, engage in, be employed, attend an exhibition, allow a person to do something on your premises, aid and abet. It's a class 1 misdemeanor. It's a class 6 felony if one of the animals is a dog. So as I mentioned before, dog fighting is treated much more seriously than cockfighting. It's also a class 6 felony if, even in a cockfight, there are gaffes or knives used to make it bloodier. That makes us a class 6 felony. If there's money wagered, if somebody pays admission, if they're possessed, trained, or under-transported with the intent to have them fight, if there's a minor present, all those things can make us class 6 felony. And this is just a provision that notes that the courts can seize the animals can be seized. The court can order that they be confiscated as a result of the animal fighting provisions. And the fines of costs can be attained by the court for the person convicted of this. It notes that doesn't prohibit authorized wildlife management activities, again, under the code, or farming activities. So that's another exemption. So as we kind of saw going through this really quickly, there are 2 types of cruelty. There's the crimes of commission. So that would be the malicious or willful intent to hurt an animal. And crimes of omission, which are neglect, and I would argue are probably the worst forms of cruelty. Now, I promised I wasn't going to show you any horrible pictures, but I did have to show you this picture of Patrick. Patrick, first of all, let me tell you, is alive and well. And if you're interested in hearing his story, go to Facebook at Patrick the Miracle. Back in 2011, he was thrown down in a plastic bag, a dump thing in a New York apartment building. He was thrown in the trash, basically. And a janitor saw the bag move and looked inside to see just what you saw in that picture and called animal control. They rushed him to the emergency center, where it was a very long process of rehabilitating him. They had to have surgery to remove the foreign objects he had tried to eat to survive. Believe it or not, he was being kept in an apartment, so people went back every day seeing this dog get worse and worse. The prosecutor called me and came to my office up in New York City. She was in New York, and asked me if there was any way we could charge a felony for this, because at that time in New Jersey, there was only a misdemeanor, or disorderly persons, as they call it in New Jersey, offense for neglect crimes. I told her I thought we could charge torture. It wasn't out on a farm where somebody didn't see this dog. They saw this dog every day. And so they had to have seen how horrible this was for this dog to suffer. As a result, she charged torture. The person pled guilty and got a pretty crappy sentence, but at least it sort of went towards showing that this kind of behavior was torture. And it was taken so seriously. There were articles all around the country. If you Google it, you'll see even Los Angeles was covering this case. As a result, I helped enact a law in New Jersey called Patrick's Law that made a felony neglect charge in that state. So now, if this ever happens again, I'm sure it has by now, they can very easily charge a felony neglect law in a case where an animal is starved to death, almost to death. So let's move on to the linkage, which what we really want to talk about here today, and how the link has been so obvious to people that work in some of the areas that we're going to talk about. I love this poster. It was a Humane Society poster that I worked for them for a number of years as their director of animal cruelty prosecution. And one of the things that we worked on was trying to educate people on how this often affects the whole family. That if there's violence within the household, everybody's a victim. Sometimes the animals are the ones who are going to get the worst of it because they're the bottom of the rung. And so they all should be treated, all should be noticed and paid attention to, because one thing can help with the other. Helping a victim, whether human or animal, can help the whole family. So I love this poster, and I always took it with me when I was speaking around the country. I also spoke to a lot of domestic violence groups as well, so that they would understand some of the new laws we were trying to pass that I'll explain to you later. So the link between animal cruelty and human violence has actually been something that's been studied for a long time. It started back in the 70s when the FBI, of all people, started looking into serial killers and what was making serial killers, what was common with them, what were they, were there any things that we could see early on that might help us prevent this? And there was one particular agent, Brantley, that was doing most of this research. He was interviewing a lot of them. And they learned very quickly doing some of these studies that one of the earliest and most dramatic indicators of an individual developing a pattern of seeking power and controlling by inflicting suffering on others was animal cruelty. And so they started looking at this connection between animal abuse and human violence and the life histories of some of these serial killers. And they realized that a lot more than they thought were going to be, had started using animals as children, torturing them as children. And then there's been other research that's been done since then that has shown a consistent pattern of animal cruelty among the abusers and more common forms of violence, especially in family violence. In 1988, the FBI study revealed that animal cruelty could be an early warning sign of a serial killer. So that's something that should get our attention. This officer Brantley did an interview, which I found fascinating when I finally was able to get a copy of it and read it. But he talked about how it was a continuum. At first, that often people would fantasize about violent actions. And then the next step would be reaching out to do these violent things. And very often, the first time they did it was against an animal. So they looked at all these murderers and they talked to them. And they said, let's go ask the offenders themselves and see what they have to say about it. And the first report he did said that 36% described killing and torturing animals as children, and 46% said they did this as adolescents. Now, he pointed out that he thinks that figure is much higher because he thought that they were reluctant to tell him. And you might think that's odd. Yeah, I'm a serial killer, but I didn't torture animals. But if you've ever prosecuted animal cruelty cases, I would often have cases where the defense attorney would come to me and say, they'll plead to, whatever you want to plead to if you'll drop the animal cruelty charge. For some reason, I guess the stigma, they didn't want to plead to that. So I kind of, when I read this, I thought, he may have something there. It probably is greater than the statistics show. He talked about one case, the Jason Massey case, that jumped out as a prominent case. He said this was a case back in 1993 in Texas, where the individual from an early age started his career killing many dogs and cats. He finally graduated at the age of 20 to beheading a 13-year-old girl and shooting her 14-year-old stepbrother to death. So this was the beginning of some of the studies that they were doing to try to see if they could find a way to prevent it from the very beginning. Other studies have shown, just in looking at animal abuse and cruelty, that animal abusers are 5 times more likely to commit violent crimes against people. They're 4 times more likely to commit property crimes. They're 3 times more likely to have drug or disorderly conduct offenses. And it's usually not an isolated event. When you find animal cruelty, there's usually other things that go along with it. It might be child abuse. It might be domestic violence. It might be juvenile crime. It might be antisocial violent behavior in some way, shape, or form. And even with animal fighting, even though it doesn't tend to attach to family violence in the same way, it does attach to other crimes such as drugs, guns, illegal gambling, violence, child abuse. So some of these crimes are all connected and they all tend to show up. Some of the serial killers that they were able to connect to animal cruelty are people such as the Boston Strangler, who killed 13 women. He used to trap dogs and cats in orange crates and shoot arrows through the boxes when he was a young man. The son of Sam, who pleaded guilty to 13 murders and attempted murder charges, started out shooting his neighbor's dog. Carol Edward Cole, executed for 5 of the 35 murders of which he was accused, said his first act of violence as a child was to strangle a puppy. Patrick Sherrill, who killed 14 co-workers at a post office and then shot himself, had a history of stealing local pets and allowing his dog to attack and mutilate them. Dennis Nielsen, who murdered 12 men, hanged a cat to see how long it would take him to die. And Peter Curtin regularly raped and killed animals in his youth. Edmund Emil Kemper, also who was a necrophilia cannibal serial killer, who earned the name the Co-Ed Killer. And after killing his mother and 6 women in Santa Cruz, California, the history showed that he was also an abuser of animals, younger before he started on humans. As a child, serial killer and rapist Ted Bundy, ultimately convicted of 2 killings, but suspected in murdering more than 40 women, witnessed his father's violence toward animals, and he himself subsequently tortured animals. And this is an interesting thing that we'll talk about later when it comes to juveniles. And that is very often the presence of animal abuse in a home with a child has a huge effect on them and their ability to adapt in normal and healthy ways. So this is something that is very problematic for juveniles. Jim Jones, this is one of my favorite examples. He was the founder of the People's Temple, and many of you might be too young to remember this guy, but you all know the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid, right? Well, Jim Jones was the drink the Kool-Aid guy that taught 900 temple members to drink poison Kool-Aid and die. And he also killed 9 other people at the nearby airstrip who tried to help. The story about him was that he, as a young man, reportedly stabbed a cat in order to hold a funeral so he could preach and explain his faith. And of course, there's always serial killer and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. He frequently performed operations on the neighborhood pets. He liked to nail live frogs to trees. And on talking about his beginning of early animal abuse, he said, "I found a dog and caught it open just to see what the insides look like. And for some reason, I thought it would be fun. It would be a fun prank to stick the head on a stake and set it out in the woods." As you know, that later developed into something much worse. And this is not something that just applies to serial killers. This particular statistic is a really a scary statistic to me, and it's something I think we should take more seriously as our laws reflect. In a study that was done in 2008, they examined a group of 44,202 adult males evaluated for sexual misconduct. And the researcher found that bestiality was the single largest risk factor and strongest predictor of increased risk for committing child sexual abuse. They found that bestiality predicted a smaller increase in risk of child sexual abuse the later in life the offender started engaging in sexual abuse of animals. But he said there is always an increase in the risk. So this is something, you know, as somebody who's worked in this area and helped to draft laws, bestiality laws, and helped to prosecutors try cases, I always found this sort of snicker in the background of people kind of chuckling about a bestiality case as if it wasn't really that important. But when you look at the statistics of what comes of this kind of behavior, it is enough to make you realize that even if you don't care about the animals, which I hope you do, but if you don't, we should care about the children that may get, or other people that might get abused as a result of the behavior that started with bestiality. Under Virginia Code 18.2-361, there are crimes against natures that cover this sort of conduct, and it's a Class 6 felony. Some other notorious killers, you all may remember Richard Allen Davis, who was convicted in 1993 of the murder of 12-year-old Polly Klaas, which was a really horrible, horrible crime. There was a report that he might have buried her alive, if you remember this case. But he also was, when they were reporting on him, they noted that he used to like to pour gasoline on cats and set them on fire in the neighborhood. And this is a really disturbing case that took place in Alabama in 2013. I remember when this happened because I was working at the Humane Society at the time, and I was watching the news like everybody else. And in Alabama, they reported that this guy named Jimmy Lee Dykes, who was a 65-year-old retired truck worker, had stormed onto a school bus. He shot and killed the bus driver, and he grabbed a little child. And he tried to get two, but one got away. And he grabbed this one little child who I believe was autistic, and he dragged him into this homemade bunker that he had created on his property. And it was all over the news. They were covering it live from the site, and I'm sure many of you saw it. They were afraid to rush the bunker because they were afraid that he had a bomb down there and he was going to blow them up. So they tried to negotiate with them. They were trying to have people surround and see if they could see and hear what was going on below. And I believe the child was in there for a day or two before they were able to finally storm it and shoot him and get the child out. But as they were covering this live, I happened to be watching, I think it was CNN or one of those shows, and they were interviewing one of his neighbors. And this neighbor was talking about him, and she said he was a very mean man. And he said, the interviewer said, have you ever had any qualms with this man? And she said, yes, he once beat my dog to death with a lead pipe for coming on his side of the road, as he called it. And the dog ended up dying a week later. And she said that he told somebody the only regret he had is he didn't beat him to death all the way. So she called animal control or whoever the authorities were in that place in Alabama, and they came out and talked to this man, and nothing ever happened. That was her story. She said, I called them, they came out, but nothing ever happened. And then she said, if a man can kill a dog and beat him with a lead pipe and brag about it, it's nothing until he's going to do it to people, basically. And she was right, obviously. So as I'm watching this, I got very annoyed by it. So I called our state director down in Alabama, and I said, can you look into this and talk to the animal control officer and see if you can find out if he did a report on this? Because in Alabama at that time, it would have been a felony for him to take a lead pipe and beat a dog like that. And of course, most of you know that if there's a felony, he couldn't have owned the weapons. He probably would have been arrested or taken to some maybe mental facility where he would have been held and evaluated. But it turns out no charges were ever filed, no report was ever written. Whatever happened wasn't anything of any account. So you can't help but wonder why somebody didn't act on this, because that would have saved a bus driver's life and a child from being traumatized if they had handled this case the way they should have. Jodi Arias also accused of being abusive to a cat that was given to her by her friend to pet sit. The owner saying the cat was so traumatized, they ended up taking him back to the Humane Society. Josh Powell, who, if you remember, killed his two children and his wife, or was accused of killing his wife by blowing them all up, was also charged with cruelty for killing his family's pet gerbils as a young man. It was his sister's gerbils, and they called the police. But at the end of the day, the family refused to testify. So he never was held accountable, never got any kind of counseling, never got any kind of repercussions. The school shootings also give us some information about what happens when we ignore animal cruelty in young people. or people in general. 9 of the school shootings between 96 and 99, in a research study done, they found approximately half the shooters had known histories of animal cruelty. There could have been many more, but the ones they knew had a history. There were at least half of them. That's a very eye-opening statistic, in my opinion. Some of the ones that were involved in this kind of animal cruelty was Kip Kinkel, who was only 15. He killed his parents after a fire in a school cafeteria. He killed 2, injured 22. He had a history of abuse and boasted about blowing up a cow and killing cats and chipmunks and squirrels by putting firecrackers in their mouth. In 98, Mitchell Johnson and Andrew Golden, he was only 11 and 13, pulled their school fire alarm and shot and killed 4 classmates and a teacher. And Golden reported they used to shoot dogs all the time with 22. In Kentucky in 1997, Michael Carneal, 14, shot and killed 3 students during a school prayer meeting. He was heard talking about throwing a cat in a bonfire. One of the first school shootings was a 16-year-old Brenda Spencer from San Diego, who opened fire, killing 2 and wounding 9. She was a known animal abuser in the neighborhood. And when they asked her why she did this, why she shot these people, she said, well, it wasn't really different than killing animals to me. One of the most disturbing ones was this young man, Luke Woodham. He also was a shooter who killed classmates and injured 7. But he wrote in his journal, which gave some really insightful information to what he was thinking. Before he went out and shot people and killed people, he had strangled, beaten, burned, and tortured his own dog, Sparkle, to death. And in his journal, he wrote about this, and he said, on Saturday of last week, I made my first kill. The victim was a loved one, my dear dog Sparkle. I'll never forget the sound of her breaking under my might. I hit her so hard I knocked the fur off her neck. It was true beauty. A mere 5 months after that, he killed his mother and shot 2 students and wounded 7. Now, the thing that struck me when I read this is the wording that he put in this particular journal. He said, I made my first kill. He didn't say my first animal kill. He said my first kill. Had he been charged, taken to court, prosecuted, held accountable, gotten mental counseling, evaluations, perhaps what happened would not have happened. In recent mass shootings, a number of the people here as well also had abused animals. In the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, Nicholas Cruz was alleged to have abused animals. He used to shoot squirrels and chickens, and he was said to have killed frogs. And he tried to kill a neighbor's potbelly pig. In 2017, Devin Kelly, the Texas church shooter, had a horrible record of domestic abuse and animal cruelty. He was cited by a witness who said that he chased a dog in a trailer park, beat the dog, punched it, threw it up in the air, and then dragged it away. So these are just further examples. And let's be aware of the fact that nobody's really looking for this stuff. If it doesn't come up in the course of some of these investigations, you may never know that some of these people were animal abusers. Excuse me. One study looked at 23 school shooters from 1998 to 2012 and found reports of prior animal cruelty in 43% of these shooters. And they also noted that 90% of our animal abuse school shooters committed cruelty in up close and personal manners by strangling, bludgeoning, mutilating, much like serial killers that we talked about. So as you can see, there's kind of a pattern here in the way these things are being handled, and the way these things are playing out. That's why just recently, in the last few years, the FBI decided that animal cruelty crimes would be included in their Uniform Crime Reporting report, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, as a specific crime, what elevates it from the general crime, which in those cases, they don't keep track of them. So now animal cruelty will be considered a crime against society and a Group A offense, as other crimes of serious nature, which include arson, burglary, kidnapping and homicide. So they understood that this is something that needs to be, we need to keep track of.
Sherry?
So before we move into the next chapter, yes.
I just wanted to remind you, we're actually past the halfway point.
Yes, I was just
wanted to take a break.
Right. Before we go to the next step, let's take a break. What do you think, John? How long?
Let's come back at in about 5 minutes at 2:58.
Okay.
And then we'll go until about 3:20 and then pause for questions, I think. Okay. Right. So if everybody would like to take a 5-minute break. And I did post the CLE link at the half-hour mark. I'll post it again when we come back from the break. And I would remind you that you will be getting the confirmation email with that same information in it. So if you don't get it through chat, don't worry, you will get it. And we'll discuss a little bit more about that. Sherry, if you would, when my picture comes back up on the screen there, hopefully it will, if you would put your mouse up to the upper right corner, you'll see 3 little dots. And yes. You can turn control back over to me.
Okay.
You should still be able to share your screen and everything, but then if we have any more difficulty with people being unmuted, I can take care of it. If you click on those 3 dots, it should say make host or something like that.
See meeting information.
Actually, put your mouse up. Do you see my picture on the screen? Can you see me? Hi.
Yes.
Okay. Go to the upper right corner of my picture. Okay. And it should show you 3 little dots that say have the word mute and 3 little dots. Or not.
I'm looking. There we go. Okay. Now, what do you want me to do after I'm on here?
If you click on the 3 dots.
I got mute, stop video chat.
Should say make host.
Got that.
And then just click on that.
Oh, I see it. There we go. Okay.
Okay. So you should still be in charge of your screen and everything, but if we have any issues in terms of unmuting or something, I can take care of that now.
Great.
All right. And we will be back, everybody, in about 3 more minutes, 2-3 more minutes. And Sherry will finish up and we'll have our question and answer. And if it is a beautiful day where you are, you can get back to doing something spring-like. Looking out my window here and thinking, I will not be doing anything outside in Roanoke where it's threatening thunderstorms right now. So we did finally get just about 100 people, and I checked 111 had actually registered through Zoom, but people I think always have different things coming up, and that's understandable. I did have a few people comment that they would have preferred this to be on a weekday, and I understand that. But we also have people that have requested weekend and evening CLE. And we're trying to find a good balance there. This is
John,
our last.
John, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
Guess not. Oh, at the very top of my screen, I've got the little panel that says mute stop video. It's actually on the top of each of my slides. So I'm having a hard time kind of seeing the very top of my slides. Any ideas on how to lower the slide or?
If you go up into the right-hand corner, do you see a thing that says view?
See more.
upper right-hand corner.
Yeah.
You see view?
No.
Okay.
Have a show video, have reactions, record, meeting info.
Oh, I know.
Panel.
You've got that bar at the top of your screen.
Yes.
You see where it says security? Do you see that? Or participants?
Secure. Yes, participants. Yeah.
Okay. Click somewhere on that in that area, or actually, wait a minute. That's not how you do it. I know there's a way to move that bar. Just trying to figure out how. Okay, so if you, well, maybe that only happens when you're sharing your screen and I can't do it on mine. Okay, do you see view options at any point on your screen, probably at the top or somewhere?
All I see is mute, stop video, participants, new share, pause, annotate, remote control, and more.
Well, click on more and see what that does.
Okay, more's got reactions, chat, record, meeting info, disable annotations, hide names, show video panel, hide floating meeting controls, share sound.
Okay, click hide floating meeting controls.
Okay. It says press escape to show.
Okay, do you now see the slide more completely?
No.
No? Okay.
Still the same. Let me try it again. Oops, that's not what I wanted.
And you don't see a little bubble with the word view on it anywhere.
No, I thought I would, but I don't see it. It's all right. I can manage it. I just can't see the very top. I can't see the very top sentence in my thing, but I know what they are for the most part, so I can manage it.
Okay, so let's get back started, and we still have about 100 people online, so that's good. I'm going to go ahead and post the CLE information again, and Sherry, you can start back when you're ready.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to switch over. We're going to talk about the specific relations to family violence, domestic violence, child abuse, violent crime, etc. Oh no. That's what happens when you change anything. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let's start first with juvenile crime and animal cruelty and why this is so important to consider. Excuse me. So I love this quote by anthropologist Margaret Mead, who said one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a child is to kill or torture an animal and get away with it. So there are lots of studies that have come out about this. In 1994, a report released by the Natural Resource Council stated that early intervention is more likely to reduce adult crime than criminal sanctions applied later in life. So in other words, the sooner we deal with children that have these kinds of issues, the better it is. They found that it's been recognized as being a serious threat and often a dress rehearsal, as we've seen with some of the cases we talked about. Lots of organizations have established that these show posing a risk to others, that juveniles could be a risk to themselves or others if they engage in these kinds of conducts. And there's some of the organizations that believe that. School Association, Department of Education, Psychological Association, National Crime Prevention, they all agree that this is a warning sign. In numerous studies, there have been correlations where they found that there were factors that associated with persistent antisocial behavior. And one of them was aggression towards people or animals. They found that violent offenders more likely have engaged in animal cruelty as a crime. As we've talked about with some of the serial killer type crimes, even with juveniles, we found that in Columbine, a lot of these types of crimes, the defendants also engaged in animal abuse. And with the Columbine case, the kids bragged about letting animals to their friends. These are just a series of cases where children, juveniles, the one in New Jersey was a case I worked on when I was in the appellate division a little bit, where this teenager invited a young boy in who was selling candy door to door and then strangled him with a lamp cord. A lot of these kids had started out abusing animals before they moved on to people. There's a book that somebody came up to me. I was doing a seminar somewhere, and they said, "Have you seen that book by Phil Chalmers called Inside the Mind of a Teen Killer?" And I hadn't, so I ordered it. And there's a whole chapter where he talks about, he's a excellent law enforcement officer who did a lot of juvenile cases. And he found that animal cruelty was one of 4 important warning signs of violent possible killers in juveniles. I have an article in my in our materials here that I wrote for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges about juveniles and animal cruelty that you'll see when you look at your materials. This is just some old prints that I find so fascinating. I teach animal law at a number of law schools around the country, and I always show these to the kids, where it shows that even back in 1751, there were people that saw this relation between juveniles turning into murderers. And it starts out with a boy shooting a dog with an arrow, and then beating his horse as he gets older, and then killing the woman who carries his child, and then eventually being hung and turned over to the vivisectionist for research, and the dog below obviously looking like he's eating what's inside of the man. But those are things that even back in the 1700s we've understood as being something we have to pay attention to, that children are often starting out showing bad signs that if we don't address them could turn into things much worse. In addition to the things we just talked about with the link to future violent offenses, there are also other things to consider with regard to animal abuse. As I said before, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. So very often if there's animal abuse in a household, there may be other things going on. There may be other crimes or bad environments that are going on in addition to the children acting out with animal abuse. Lots of studies have found that that animal cruelty as a child, these kids also reported child abuse or domestic violence in their home. One New Jersey study found that animal abuse occurred in 88% of families that were under state supervision for physical abuse. So they were not only abusing animals, the children, but they were also being abused. Children who abuse animals are more likely to have been treated violently within their families, with higher frequencies of sexual victimization. So witnessing violence, as I talked about with the Ted Bundy case, can have a very negative effect on their development. They might suffer from mental illness or drug dependency. They might become delinquent or have criminal acts. Witnessing this violence by an adolescent is associated with significantly higher levels of animal cruelty by the child, especially when it's perpetuated by a friend or a relative, family member. So there are some things that they suggest that people do when they're working with children that might be involved in this sort of thing. That is where a parent or an abuser might tell them not to talk about things. So some of the assessments that, if you suspect that, might be asking children who might have been told not to talk about their own abuse, but might give clues if you ask them about their pets. And if anything ever happened to their pets, you might get signs that are a red flag to something going on in the household. Cross-reporting is also very important for this reason. A number of states mandate that animal control or humane society officers report suspicious or known child abuse as a result of this link. Most states do mandate child abuse reporting, and some states mandate that protective services also report suspected animal abuse for this very reason, so they can look closer. Now, I'm going to show just a little bit about domestic violence in this last grouping. And that is probably the one place I've seen the most animal abuse associated with family violence. And this also includes not just the spouse, but the children as well. In America, 1 out of 4 women experience domestic violence in their lifetime. And many of these women survive by leaving their home to get to a local shelter, but some will refuse to leave because they are fearful of their animals being in danger. There are lots of studies that show that researchers found in big metropolitan areas between 94 and 2000 that there are risk factors for abuse and interpersonal violence related to animal abuse. And they also found that there were risks associated as a potential way to decrease mortality. And that was addressing some of these issues before it got so bad. And one of the 4 things they found was animal abuse. Looking at databases of persons prosecuted for cruelty, so they went to the opposite side, they compared the group to similar demographic characteristics, and they found that animal abusers were 5 times more likely to have engaged in interpersonal violence. Another thing that's in your materials is an article that I wrote with 2 psychologists from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges that talk about this specific issue. So up to 48% of battered women delayed leaving a dangerous situation, they said, because they were concerned about their pets. And I saw that firsthand when I was doing domestic violence cases, where they were terrified to leave. They were afraid if they left, their animals would be killed or abused. Multiple studies have found that as many as 71% of battered women reported that their pets had been threatened, harmed, or killed by their partners. And a national survey of battered women's shelters determined that 85% of shelters indicated that women seeking shelter at the safe houses talked about incidences of animal abuse. So this is not a rare thing. 68% of women who were victims of domestic violence reported that the perpetuator also abused their animals. And the vast majority of this occurred in the presence of the women, 87%, and in the presence of the children, 75%. And that was documented by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Studies that focus on intentionally false reports of domestic violence showed that false allegations were much less common than the problem of victims failing to report or denying things that happened. Any of us who have worked in domestic violence would get calls from a victim out of the blue after we'd heard so many horrible things, where they would say, I just decided I want to dismiss the protection order. And when you'd say, why? A lot of times you never got a straight answer from them. And you always suspect that there was some reason that they were being leveraged not to hold on to that protection order. Children also in these situations have shown psychological maladjustment and higher risk of becoming victims and abusers themselves because it's an early indicator of violent propensities, as we just discussed. And children exposed to domestic violence have an increased risk for behavioral problems, including animal abuse. And a scary statistic I found in one magazine I was reading said that mothers of children who are victims or children of mothers who are victims of domestic violence are 6 times more likely than other children to die before the age of 5. That's a really scary. I only saw that in one place, but it kind of got my attention when I saw that. So it tells us basically that we better take this issue seriously, or we're putting domestic violence victims at risk of serious injury or death. These threats often come in the form of threatening to hurt or kill a victim, the children, other family members, or their pets. And they may also threaten to commit suicide or file forced charges against the victim or report her to child services. And so only approximately 1/4 of all physical assaults or 1/5 of all rapes are even reported. So we know that when we get large numbers, it's probably even higher than it indicates in these studies. So what we know is that victims often stay in their home to protect their pets, and abusers use pets to punish the victim. So we need to understand ways we can provide help for the victim as well as the animals in these cases. We learned from Katrina that lots of people stayed in their homes to protect their animals. And when that happened, Congress enacted the Pets Evacuation Transportation Standards Act. And that required local and state emergency plans to cover pets and service animals in order to qualify for funds. And it worked. I was up north in New Jersey during the last Sandy storm, and I heard that the people coming to help were willing to take the dogs and the cats and their family animals to keep the victims from staying put in their homes. So likewise, with domestic violence victim that may be at risk for staying in a dangerous situation, there has to be a way to protect them too. Complicating the issue here is the fact that animals are considered property in all 50 states. And if an abuser refuses to relinquish a pet, police officers and courts are often reluctant to get involved in what they would consider a property dispute, a marital property dispute. And since abusers tend to control things very often, things from the license or the vet bills are often under the abuser's name in a family. But if you're a family and you have a husband and children, and I ask you, who does the dog belong to or who's the cat belong to? You would say it belongs to all of us. He's our family animal. I found out the hard way when I sent, as a prosecutor, a police officer out to get a victim's dog because she was afraid of what was going to happen to the dog. And the officer said we were going to, but he had the license in his name. He had, the chip in the back of the dog's in his name. Everything was in the abuser's name. How can we take the dog away? So that's a problem that comes up often too. That's why it's important to have these protection orders in place, because it might be the first way that a victim can get out of the home without fear of retaliation. They're considered property in all states, so they have a restraining order that allows them, or protection order, as you call them in Virginia, the risk of returning to the home to care for the animal. And they often do that. And as I said before, because they threaten and dismiss their charges and those types of things, there has to be a way to help safely get them out of the house. And as I said before, beloved animals are often the easiest target for an abuser to go after, because assault of a victim or a child or doing something to destroy the house might get more attention than just having the dog disappear or the cat disappear, even if especially if they know that victim loves that animal so much. In 2006, the first law was passed in Maine to create a provision within the protection orders to include animals. And Susan Wash testified saying it wasn't just the dogs and cats, but the sheep and chickens. She was terrified for their welfare. She knew if she were to leave, he wouldn't hesitate to kill them. He had done it before. And this is the first time a law was passed to include animals in restraining orders. So now we have lots of states since then that have added a provision within their protection orders to allow animals to be included. We have about 35 states plus DC and Puerto Rico to allow victims to include their animals in the restraining orders. Virginia has a provision now as well that allows animals to be included. And states also have express provisions that allow pets to be included, even if they don't have a specific provision. They have a place where they can add it. Illinois' law is a good law because it says, it's a simple sentence, all you need, grant the petitioner the exclusive care and custody or control of an animal owned, possessed, kept, held by either the petitioner or the respondent of a minor child residing in the residence. That's all you need to put into the law. Virginia has this law, and their provision says, granting the petitioner the possession of any companion animal as defined under section 3.2-6500 if such petitioner meets the definition of owner. Now, I know we're a little short on time, but one of the things I like to point out is why I like the Illinois law better than the language in the Virginia law. I'm sure you could guess by now, and if we had an interactive thing here, I would ask you, but the reason I'm not as crazy about the Virginia law is because that word owner, as I mentioned to you before, very often the owner is not necessarily the person who is going to care for the animal. So I kind of like the law in Illinois that says exclusive care, custody, control of any animal owned, possessed, leased, kept, or held by either the petitioner or the respondent or a minor child. So in the same way we grant the house through the custody of the victim, we may give them the car to have pending the disposition of all these charges. I think it's better if the animals are also included in that situation where you can give them to the victim temporarily so they can't be leveraged to cause any kind of way to make a victim dismiss something or to go back to the house. If there is no specific law that applies in a state, or if the one that's in Virginia doesn't work, there's also provisions like this one that allow for a judge to do pretty much anything they want to do if they're fearful of threats or criminal offenses resulting in injury. So it's another way to try to get a judge to order something. So allowing pets in the restraining orders removes one obstacle for a victim leaving an abusive situation. And including pets in these orders are essential to protecting the animal as well as ensuring the victim. And so protecting the animals, you're protecting the victim. In addition, it also can help authorize law enforcement to assist the victim in retrieving pets left so that the victim doesn't go back there to try to get them, which happens quite frequently. Absent that, a victim's likely to go try to get them when they think the abusers left the premises. And that is just a recipe for disaster. I was getting ready to do a seminar for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges at one of their annual meetings up at New York City at the Marriott Marquis, and I was planning putting it all together when a case popped up in the newspaper that had recently happened in New York. And so it was a perfect example for me to show, the judges in this case that this actually does happen. So in 2004, a woman went back to try to get her dog from this guy, who, by the way, was a lawyer. And when she went back to try to get her little dog, he killed her. And unfortunately, she had been offered a place to stay, a place to go. She had lots of support, but she was more than anything worried about her little dog. And she went back to get him. So it's important to understand that there's also a bond with children and their pets. So if a victim takes the children and leaves the house, having the dog or cat with them may also help ease that transition of a divorce or a violent situation in domestic violence and those types of stressful things. And we know that so many people deal with domestic violence, and these minor children live in families in which severe domestic violence occurs. So having their pet there makes a big difference. There's also a number of safe haven programs around the country. There's a place called the Hasimsa House. And if you go to that, it tells you state by state places that will allow pets to be housed pending disposition in domestic violence cases. So if a victim has to flee to a shelter and the shelter doesn't allow for pets to stay there, these are records of places that will allow animals to be held temporarily. And if you look, you'll see there's tons in Virginia. Just pull them up on that link and you can find where they're staying. Just briefly mentioning this also can happen with domestic, with elder abuse as well. And so it's important to consider that if you work with elderly people, that sometimes they're leveraged as well in the same way. I don't have time to go through these, but it is something to be aware of. So that's my information if you have any questions. And also, I run, if any of you are prosecutors, I have a prosecutor Google group for prosecutors that do animal cruelty cases so that they can brainstorm together. So if you're interested in that, you can contact me as well. So we do have a few more minutes so we can talk and have questions if anybody has any questions.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. If you want to stop sharing your screen, you should have a thing to click that at the top or bottom of your screen somewhere. I often forget to mention this, and so I did post it in chat, but let me just let everybody know. We raised $470 for Cat's Cradle of Harrisonburg with this CLE. And I'll be sending that money through their website later. And I'd like to thank Sherry for recommending them as the charity. Sherry, you're still sharing your screen.
Oh, here it is. Sorry.
There. Let's
Sorry
see
about
here.
that.
All right, there we go. Okay. So if you have any questions, you can post them in chat, or you can unmute and open your camera if you want to talk to us directly. Are there intervention resources available in Virginia for juvenile defendants who are abusing animals? So are there any mental health agencies or services that they can get that you're aware of, Sherry?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm sure there must be. I can find that out and probably let you know. One important resource in Virginia that a lot of states don't have is the Attorney General's office has a Attorney General there that works only on animal cases. Her name's Michelle Welsh, and she's fantastic. So they may also have some information that would help you know exactly which departments of state would be the right ones to reach out to with regard to juvenile intervention and help, basically.
Somebody's asked, will this be recorded to watch again? Yes, it will be posted on the website. Not for CLE credit, of course, but just for informational purposes. I believe, as I mentioned earlier, Sherry will be getting that yes. PowerPoint text version of it to those of you who want to review the material again, and we'll get that out to you by email. Of course, I've posted this in the chat, but the email, everybody is now entitled to an hour and a half, the full hour and a half credit. The link to the form, I'll post that one more time here in chat if I can find out where I've got it and make sure I get it to everybody. Somebody says, can victims of animal loss from cruelty sue for emotional distress?
That's a really tricky question.
That is a very tricky question, given the laws regarding both negligent and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the difference between them being that the need to show physical manifestation for negligence and to have a medical opinion for intentional. So my response usually is anybody can sue for anything. But you have to know the law very carefully. I would think where it's being done deliberately to impact the other individual, I would think there would be a fairly good case for it, particularly because it's probably not the only form of emotional abuse.
You're exactly right about that. If it's intentional infliction of emotional distress, you have a much better chance of getting damages for that. If it's not, you have much less chances. But just to give you a broad answer, if this is a criminal case, you usually seek restitution, and that's a way to get at least some money back. If it's not a criminal case, then you may want to look to trying sort of different ideas. Like some cases have won damages on the idea that it was because they are property in every state, their special property, their intrinsic value of the animal is more than just the base of what the property would sell for, like a car, which you'd pay for an animal if you bought it. So there have been some cases where they've been able to get much more than they would have gotten since claiming it was intrinsic value, like it was antique, something that belonged in your family. And some courts have accepted that and awarded more money than they would have just from the basic property value of the animal.
Somebody asked about making contributions. If you want to, you can go directly to the Cat's Cradle of Harrisonburg website. They do have a link there to make contributions there. If you want to do it through VMVLA, just go to our charitable contributions page, and you will find a link there to make it through Square online using your credit card, and you just scroll through the list of charities and designate Cat's Cradle. Here's a comment saying, as a magistrate for Virginia, it's very helpful to see the connection between companion animal provisions in the emergency protective orders and domestic violence. Thank you, Sherry. Very informative. Yeah, I'll mention very briefly.
That's great.
25 or more years ago in my career, I first encountered a case involving criminal charges for inflicting injury on a farm animal. So back then, that was the felony level because of the economic value. And then shortly after that, there was a very sort of celebrated case here in the Roanoke Valley where a person had deliberately killed a companion animal. It was very obvious that it was being done for the purpose of inflicting pain on the owner. And the fact that that could only be tried as a misdemeanor caused a great uproar. And there have been a number of significant changes to the law fairly recently, actually, that have broadened out the availability of criminal prosecutions. But interestingly, as Sherry mentioned at the very beginning, they're not mostly in the criminal code. And I'm willing to bet that she's right. You've got to bring that code with you, or the judge is going to go, I don't, is this a crime? Is this criminal? No. You know, and I wonder if maybe there shouldn't be a section of 19.2 instead of where it is in 6 point, I think, what is it, 6.2, 6.1, something like that. But somebody says thank you to you for giving up your Saturday.
Happy to do it.
Yeah, I at one point I did look out just recently, and the rain has started, at least where I am. So hopefully it's not going to hit everybody up and down the valley, but it is raining here, or at least it was a few minutes ago in Roanoke. Okay, so we're actually at our time point. So if there are no more questions or comments, I will remind everybody that our next CLE is on Law Day, and involves the question of foreign policy and the use of executive power, and I think it's a very appropriate topic for Law Day. Then later in the month, we will have our second Veterans Rights CLE on Memorial Day. I have not posted that up in the on the website yet. I will get to that before the 15th of this month, when the email will go out announcing the upcoming CLEs. Then we have our client record and law office record retention and destruction policy CLE being offered on 3 different times, including a shredathon at the Vinton War Memorial in Vinton. If you've got boxes of records you've been meaning to dispose of, you can bring them to Vinton and shred them for free. And the last of our first half of the year CLEs on Virginia's new gun laws and how to advise your clients on maintaining their weapons properly and avoiding potential civil or even criminal liability for their misuse. I'm just making sure there's no more questions here. Okay. And then we're going to take a little break. July and August, we'll be getting ready for our fall seminar, which the courses have been posted on the website, but not the registration yet. And Harrisonburg 2021. We are definitely almost 99.9% sure that we're going to pull this off at the Doubletree in Harrison with CLE and some social events and some really good things. And that'll also be in the newsletter email going out next week. So again, thank you, Sherry, for your willingness to provide us with this very valuable CLE. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. For those who have not been able to download the CLE form from chat, you remember you will be getting a confirmation email sometime later this evening with that same information. And if you do not receive the email confirming your attendance by, let's say, 9 o'clock tonight, please send an email to the VMVLA after checking your spam folder. so that we can make sure that we have your attendance recorded and make sure that you get the CLE form.
Hey, John, can I make one quick comment before we log off?
Oh, absolutely. Certainly.
I reached out to the IDC to see if this would qualify for juvenile recertification credit, and they said yes.
Now that is good to know. Thank you, Courtney. Yeah, we tried to get juvenile GAL credit for it, and apparently they thought that it wasn't
Right.
wasn't for that. But I did not even think about the Indigent Defense Commission. So yeah, this, I think that's a very good point to make, and I'll make a note to myself just to follow up with them to make sure that they have the information they need.
Right, because that's where I am right now. I'm looking at it on the ACES recertification little portal that they have on their website, and it's not listed as an approved course yet. But I emailed them specifically with the link to this course, and they said, yes, we will accept it. So I know that it's in the works, and maybe it's just not up there yet. But I heard it from the horse's mouth.
The thing is that Indigent Defense Commission is not quite as efficient. They don't have like a form that you can fill out or anything, right? You just have to sort of send them an email and say, hey, we've got this CLE course. Can you count it towards recertification for appointed counsel? Whereas the juvenile JGL, there's a form you fill out, you submit the material, and then they let you know. So I'll make sure that that Indigent Defense Commission definitely has this on their list. And thank you for bringing that up, Courtney. Okay, so if there are no more questions or comments, thank you again, everybody. I hope that where you are, you can enjoy the rest of your weekend without intervention of rain or anything. And we'll hopefully see everybody again on Law Day for our Law Day seminar. So bye-bye.